7:03 a.m., January 24th, 1989, Florida State Prison. Outside the gates, it is a macabre carnival. Hundreds of strangers are cheering, banging frying pans, and wearing t-shirts that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn." But inside the stark, silent chamber housing old Sparky, the charismatic charm that lured dozens of young women to their deaths is entirely useless. In exactly 13 minutes, the most famous serial killer in America is going to die in a wooden chair built in 1923. He is finally out of time, out of appeals, and staring into the face of a 2,000-volt reckoning. But right now, in these final minutes, he's not performing. And that's the part almost nobody talks about. For 10 years, the entire country watched this man perform. In courtrooms, on camera, in interviews, he orchestrated himself. Soon, the prison superintendent is going to lean toward him and ask the question they ask every condemned man: do you have any last words? What he says back, to two specific people by name, is going to reopen a question that true crime writers, psychologists, and his own biographers have never fully closed. Was there a real person under the performance? Or was the performance all there ever was? I'm not going to answer that yet, because to understand the sheer weight of what happens in that chair at 7:16 a.m., you have to look at the twisted road of the 72 hours before it. That is when the most controlled man in the American legal system started coming apart in ways nobody, not even the people who studied him for a decade, saw coming. Here's what I can tell you right now. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He chain-smoked through the night. He made a phone call he'd never get to make again. And days before he sat in that chair, he did something that contradicted everything he'd sworn to juries, judges, and reporters for 10 straight years. We're going to go through all of it. Not the crimes. You already know the outline of those. They've had 5 books and a Zac Efron movie. This is the part that gets skipped. The last week of Ted Bundy's life, minute by minute, and what it actually revealed about him when the cameras thought they already had the whole story. Before we get to that final night, though, I want to rebuild something first. Not the myth people repeat about him, but the actual mechanism. How a man with no supernatural ability became so good at being believed that it took law enforcement in 4 different states years to catch up to him. If cases that hold up under the actual paper trail are your thing, subscribe now, because this is the kind of deep dive this channel runs every week, and you don't want to come in on part 2. Act 1. The masks start here. 1971, a suicide crisis hotline in Seattle. A young volunteer sits next to a night shift partner, talking strangers off ledges at 2 a.m. Years later, that partner, a woman named Anne Rule, would write the best-selling true crime book of the century about him. But that night, she didn't know she was sitting next to one. In her own words, she remembered him as kind, solicitous, empathetic. That's not a defense attorney's spin. That's the writer who would go on to call him a sadistic sociopath in print, describing the same man before she knew what he was. Go back further, and the profile only gets stranger. Bundy was born in 1946 to a 22-year-old unwed mother at a home for unwed mothers in Vermont, and for years afterward, his own family told him a lie designed to protect his mother from the stigma of the era, that his grandparents were his parents, and that his real mother, Louise, was actually his older sister. He grew up calling his own mother by her first name. He didn't learn the truth until he was well into his youth. Make of that what you will. Biographers have spent 40 years arguing about how much it explains, but it's worth knowing that the man famous for constructing false identities spent his own childhood living inside one that wasn't his idea. This is the actual subplot running under everything else in this story. Ted Bundy's real weapon was never his hands. It was your instinct to trust a nice-looking guy with his arm in a cast who says he needs help carrying something to his car. Psychology profilers who studied his case afterward kept landing on the same word: the mask, not a disguise. A mask implies there's a fixed face under it. What made Bundy genuinely rare, clinically speaking, is that investigators struggled to find a face under his at all. He was a law student, a Republican campaign volunteer. The kind of clean-cut, articulate young man that in 1974, America simply did not fit the profile of a predator, which is exactly why campuses from Washington State to Utah to Florida spent that decade telling young women to walk in groups, check their doors twice, and still, over and over, one would go missing after being seen getting into a car with a friendly stranger who seemed to need help. That's the part of this story that rarely gets enough weight. The women he killed were not careless. They were doing everything right. He simply didn't look like the thing they'd been warned about. By the time Florida caught him for good, in 1978, he'd already escaped police custody twice. Once by leaping out a courthouse library window, once by sawing through the ceiling of a Colorado jail cell and vanishing for weeks. He killed at least 3 more young women, including 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, during that second escape alone. And when it came time for Florida to actually try him for murder, the killings of Florida State students Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, and later Kimberly Leach, Bundy did something almost nobody facing the death penalty does. He fired his lawyers and defended himself. He cross-examined the detectives who'd arrested him. And in one of the strangest scenes an American courtroom has ever recorded, he called his girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, to the stand during his own trial, asked her to marry him in front of the jury, and, using an old legal loophole and a notary he'd arranged to have present, actually married her, on the record, mid-trial. She had his child less than a year later. That's who the country watched for a decade. Not a man cowering from justice, a man who treated his own murder trial like a stage he'd built for himself. Here's the thing though, the mask didn't always stay on. In 1978, in the hours after Pensacola police finally arrested him for good, an interrogating officer got Bundy talking, just for a moment, without the performance running. What came out wasn't charm. It was 11 words. "I'm the most cold-blooded son of a bitch you'll ever meet." Hold on to that sentence. We're coming back to it. That performance is what bought him 10 more years of life. It's also, as you're about to see, exactly what started to fail him first. Act 2. The decade on the clock. Death row doesn't move fast, and Bundy understood the machinery of delay better than almost any inmate in Florida history. He'd gone to law school, after all. Through the 1980s, his attorneys, James Coleman, and a young lawyer named Polly Nelson, who'd later write her own book about the case, filed appeal after appeal, working every procedural angle the system allowed. 3 separate times, they won stays of execution, once with hours to spare before a scheduled date. Bundy gave interviews from death row. He corresponded with journalists. He kept, in his own strange way, performing for an audience, because as long as the audience was watching, the appeals kept working, and the chair stayed empty. 10 years is a long time to hold an audience's attention from a cell. Bundy managed it. And that's arguably the most underrated part of this entire case. It wasn't just that he killed for 5 years without getting caught. It's that once caught, tried, and sentenced to die 3 separate times, he still found a way to make the legal system dance to his schedule for a full decade afterward. But appeals aren't infinite, and by January of 1989, after 10 years of death row and 3 exhausted stays, Bundy's legal options had run out for good. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final petitions in a series of votes, narrow ones, 6-3, 5-4, but rejections all the same. Florida Governor Bob Martinez signed the death warrant. The date was set, January 24th. When a prison spokesman told reporters how Bundy reacted to hearing his last appeal had failed, he didn't describe defiance. He didn't describe the composed, needling courtroom performer from a decade of trials. He used 2 words, visibly shaken. Sit with that for a second, because it's the first real crack in 10 years of performance. This was a man who had cross-examined his own arresting officers without flinching, who had proposed marriage to a witness stand as a legal maneuver. And the moment the legal machinery he understood better than his own lawyers finally actually ran out, for the first time on record, someone who watched him do it said he looked scared. He had exactly 1 week left, and in that week, the man who spent a decade insisting he was innocent was about to do something none of his own attorneys saw coming. But just when the world assumed Ted Bundy's manipulations were finally over, that all that was left was a countdown, the final days of his life revealed something darker than anyone following this case for 10 years expected. Not more denial, confession. Act 3, 30 women, 7 states. Here's the man the public thought they knew. The one who, from 1974 to 1989, never once admitted guilt in an American courtroom, who maintained, under oath, in front of juries, that he was the victim of coincidence and sloppy police work. That version of Ted Bundy existed for 15 years. He lasted until about January 16, 1989. With 8 days left to live, Bundy requested meetings with investigators, not his own lawyers, actual homicide detectives, flown in from Washington, Utah, Idaho, and Colorado, states carrying decades-old unsolved cases with his name attached in the margins. And across those final days, sitting across a table from men who'd waited years for this conversation, Bundy started talking. He confessed, not to 1 or 2 killings he could no longer deny, to a confirmed serial account of roughly 30 murders across 7 states: California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, spanning 1973 to 1978. FBI agent Bill Hagmaier, who conducted some of the last interviews of Bundy's life, walked away from those sessions with more detail on the Bundy case than a decade of investigators had assembled combined. And the detectives from 4 states weren't the only law enforcement in the building that week. There's a second subplot running underneath the confessions, one most people have never heard, and it tells you almost everything about how Bundy needed to see himself. Back in 1984, 5 years before any of this, Bundy had written a letter from death row to a Washington state homicide detective named Robert Keppel, the same investigator who'd chased Bundy's own Pacific Northwest murders years earlier. The letter offered something strange. Bundy wanted to be a consultant. Seattle had an active, uncaught serial killer of its own by then, one the press had started calling the Green River Killer, and Bundy, from a cell in Florida, awaiting his own death sentence, offered to profile him. Keppel took the offer, partly because he was curious what Bundy could actually contribute, and partly because he suspected the real prize wasn't insight into a stranger. It was a confession out of Bundy himself. He was right on both counts. Over interviews stretching from 1984 into 1988 and one final session just days before the execution, Bundy analyzed a killer he'd never met with unsettling fluency, correctly guessing details about how the man operated, and, in the same sessions, finally admitted to killing at least 8 women in Washington state, including one victim, Georgianne Hawkins, whose case had sat unsolved for over a decade. The Green River Killer wouldn't actually be caught for another 12 years, and not because of anything Bundy told them. DNA evidence eventually connected the murders to a truck painter named Gary Ridgway, who'd go on to confess to 49 killings. Bundy's profile turned out to be smart, occasionally accurate, and, in the end, completely beside the point. What it tells you isn't about the Green River case at all. It's about a man who, with days left to live, still needed to be the expert in the room. For the record, the official record, the one that exists independent of anything Bundy himself said, Florida's case files list 20 confirmed murders, 30 confessed, and investigators who worked the case for years believed the real number was higher still. Some estimates go past 60. Nobody, including the man who did it, ever gave a number anyone fully trusted. That's not a footnote. That's the entire unresolved shape of who he was. Even his confession couldn't be taken as complete honesty, because honesty had never once been the point. Because here's the catch, and it's the ugliest part of this whole final chapter. Bundy didn't confess out of remorse. He confessed as a negotiation. He offered investigators more names, more locations, more closure for grieving families, in exchange for one thing: more time, a delay on his execution. Governor Bob Martinez refused to negotiate. Read that twice. Because it's the whole story in one sentence. A man who spent a decade performing innocence spent his final week performing guilt, using 30 dead women as a bargaining chip for his own survival, right up until the state of Florida told him no. The governor's answer meant one thing. The clock Bundy had been racing for 10 years had officially run out of road. He had one night left, and what happened inside his cell that night is where this story stops being about the killer everyone thinks they already understand. Act 4, The Last Night Evening, January 23, 1989. A phone rings in the home of Fred Lawrence, a Methodist minister in Gainesville. On the other end is Jim Coleman, Bundy's attorney, with a request. Ted Bundy is asking for someone to sit with him through his final night. Lawrence, who had never met the man, says yes without hesitating. He drives to Florida State Prison and takes a chair outside Bundy's cell. He doesn't leave until morning. From here, every hour that passes is an hour Bundy doesn't get back, and prison staff who were there described exactly how he spent them. He didn't sleep. He chain-smoked cigarette after cigarette in a cell where for the first time in his life, no upcoming appeal, no upcoming trial date, no future performance was waiting on the other side of the night. According to the prison spokesman who checked on him periodically, part of that night was spent in prayer with Lawrence. Wire reporters covering the execution described him, secondhand, as spending it weeping. Weeping. The same man who, 8 days earlier, told investigators he felt no guilt for any of it. That contradiction gets sharper because that same night, Bundy did one more thing entirely on his own terms. He requested a taped interview with James Dobson, a psychologist and religious broadcaster who would air the footage the following day, the day of the execution itself. On camera, hours from death, Bundy described a self-diagnosed addiction to pornography that he claimed had escalated over years into the violence that defined his life. Dobson later said Bundy cried more than once during their conversation and came away describing what looked like real sorrow for the families he'd destroyed. Ask yourself the same question his own biographer has spent decades turning over. Was that a man finally telling the truth in the only hours he had left where truth cost him nothing? Or was it his very last performance? One final interview, one final audience, one final chance to be remembered as something other than what the official record already said he was. Somewhere in that same window of hours, Bundy picked up a phone and called his mother, Louise Bundy, back home in Tacoma, Washington. Twice, she would later tell reporters he sounded, in her words, at peace with himself, and that in that call, he told her he was sorry for the pain he'd caused her, admitting that part of who he really was had stayed hidden from her his entire life. At the end of the second call, not knowing if it truly was the end, she told her son the only thing a mother had left to say, that he would always be her precious son. Around 5 a.m., a guard offered him the tradition given to every inmate on execution morning in Florida, a final meal, whatever he wanted. Bundy declined to request anything. Prison staff brought him the standard tray anyway: steak, eggs, toast, hash browns. A little before 5, he never touched it. Outside the prison gates, in the dark, cars had already started arriving hours before sunrise. Lawn chairs unfolded on the shoulder of the road, coolers propped open. Local vendors, sensing an opportunity, were reportedly already selling novelty t-shirts to a crowd that hadn't even reached its full size yet. Local radio stations ran live countdowns. None of them knew, at 5 a.m., that the man they were counting down for hadn't touched his breakfast, hadn't slept, and was still sitting 15 feet from a minister who'd been up with him the entire night. By 6 a.m., the field outside the gates was full enough that state troopers had begun directing traffic like it was a stadium event. One Florida Corrections spokesperson, describing the scene years later, said satellite dishes had gone up across the highway from the prison overnight like mushrooms after rain. A small local press office, suddenly the epicenter of a national broadcast. Even Bundy hadn't fully let go of that spotlight. 2 days earlier, he'd floated the idea of holding one last press conference of his own, on his own terms, before quietly canceling it. Right up to the end, some part of him was still managing the story. Inside, the countdown had a different texture entirely. Not a party, a procedure. Guards moved through a checklist they'd rehearsed for other inmates, and never once for a name this famous. If a single night can hold this much contradiction, a man weeping with a minister, performing for a camera, and negotiating for his life, all within the same 8 hours, it's worth asking what else about this case has been flattened into a headline over the last 35 years. That's genuinely the reason I dig into the primary documents instead of just repeating the shorthand version. And if that's useful to you, the subscribe button is right there, because we've got more of these coming. By sunrise, the last appeal filed on Bundy's behalf, a final, desperate motion, had already been denied. There was nothing left between him and 7 a.m. Act 5, 7 a.m. Just before 7, guards came for him. He was dressed in prison-issued blue slacks and a pale blue shirt. No suit, no tie, none of the presentation he'd spent a decade curating for cameras. He was walked into the execution chamber and strapped into a 100-pound oak chair Florida had been using since 1923, nicknamed, without much affection, Old Sparky. 42 people sat behind a plexiglass wall to watch. Not strangers, detectives who'd built the case against him, prosecutors who'd argued it in front of juries, the highway patrolman who, years earlier, had found 12-year-old Kimberly Leach's body where Bundy left it. And among the 42, members of victims' families, present, finally, for the one part of this decade-long story where Bundy didn't get to control the outcome. Think about what that room actually represented. For 10 years, in courtroom after courtroom, Bundy had been the one asking the questions, cross-examining the officers now sitting a few feet from the chair, needling the same prosecutors now watching him get strapped into it. The seating chart alone was the closest thing to justice some of those 42 people were ever going to get, and everyone in that room knew it. Prison Superintendent Tom Barton leaned toward him and asked the question asked of every condemned man in America. Did he have any last words? Bundy hesitated. Witnesses in the room described his voice as quiet, trembling. He turned his head, not toward the 42 witnesses, not toward the cameras that had followed him for a decade, but toward two specific men standing beside him, his attorney, Jim Coleman, and the minister who'd sat outside his cell all night, Fred Lawrence. "Jim and Fred," he said, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." That's it. That's the whole sentence. No mention of the 12-year-old girl whose body was found in a state park. No mention of the 30 women he'd confessed to, or the dozens more investigators still suspected. No mention of a single name that wasn't already standing in that room to support him. Remember the sentence I asked you to hold on to, the one he gave police in 1978, the only time on record the mask seemed to genuinely slip. "I'm the most cold-blooded son of a bitch you'll ever meet." 11 years and 1 execution chamber later, his actual last words were about love. Here's the question I want to leave sitting with you, because I don't think there's a clean answer. A man who spent his entire adult life apparently incapable of empathy for the women he targeted found, in his very last sentence on Earth, something that sounded exactly like tenderness, pointed carefully, deliberately, at the only 2 people in the room who had shown him any kindness in his final hours. Is that proof he had the capacity for real feeling all along, and simply never extended it to anyone who needed it? Or is it the last, smallest example of the same selective performance that defined every year before it? Generosity reserved only for an audience that could still give something back. The most cold-blooded man in the room, by his own admission, spent his last breath being warm to exactly 2 people. Everyone else, including 30-plus women who never got a single kind word from him while they were alive, got nothing. A strap was pulled across his mouth and chin. A metal skull cap, wired and soaked, was bolted into place, a black veil falling over what remained visible of his face. Barton gave the signal. At 7:16 a.m., an anonymous executioner activated the chair. 2,000 volts surged through Ted Bundy's body for about 1 minute. Witnesses closest to the chair reported a visible tensing, his hands clenching against the restraints, a thin trace of smoke. A doctor stepped forward, checked for a pulse, and pronounced him dead. 10 years, 3 stays of execution, 30 confessed victims, and 1 final sentence about love for the 2 men standing closest to him. And at 7:16 in the morning, on a Tuesday, it was over. Act 6. What was waiting outside? Word travels fast through a crowd that's been waiting all night. Outside the gates of Florida State Prison, several hundred people, some accounts put the number well past 500 by sunrise, had gathered before dawn, camped out with lawn chairs and coolers like they were tailgating a football game. When a witness ran out of the prison to confirm Bundy was dead, the field erupted. People cheered, banged pots and pans together. Somewhere in the crowd, fireworks went off. Hand-painted signs bounced over people's heads. Burn, Bundy, burn. Tuesday is Friday. One police officer on the scene asked for his reaction, said he wished he'd been the one to flip the switch himself. Not everyone standing there felt the same simple satisfaction. A police chief from nearby Gulfport, watching the same celebration, offered a different reflection to reporters that morning, that whatever Bundy had done, he was, in the end, still a human being. Death penalty opponents who saw footage of the crowd that day pointed to it for years afterward as an argument against capital punishment itself, a crowd of parents and children cheering a man's death like a sporting event. Others, including families who'd waited a decade for this exact morning, called it something else entirely, the only justice this particular case was ever going to offer them. Both of those reactions are true at the same time, and this is one of those rare historical mornings where you can watch them exist side by side in the same photographs. Grief and celebration, separated by a few hundred feet of Florida asphalt. Decades later, Bob Deckel, the state attorney who'd prosecuted Bundy back in 1979 and watched him perform in courtrooms for years before watching him die, was asked to sum up who Bundy actually was. He didn't reach for anything clinical or dramatic. He said Bundy simply wanted as much attention as he could possibly get, that he wasn't insane, wasn't confused about right and wrong, he just didn't care about the difference. 10 years of profilers, biographers, and made-for-TV psychologists, and the closest thing this case ever got to a final verdict came from the man who'd cross-examined him in court, and just watched him long enough to stop looking for a more complicated answer. Whichever side of that you land on, it's worth remembering both existed in the same crowd on the same morning, because the sanitized version of this story usually keeps only one of them. If you want the full, unflattened version of cases like this one, that's what this channel exists for, and the notification bell means you won't miss the next one. An autopsy followed. Medical examiners, still chasing an explanation for what Bundy was, checked his brain for damage, for some physical abnormality that could account for a decade of murder. They found nothing. No trauma, no defect, nothing that made him medically distinguishable from anyone else. Whatever Ted Bundy was, it wasn't visible under a microscope. It never had been. That was always the entire, uncomfortable point of him. So, back to the question we opened with. What actually happens in the final 24 hours of America's most infamous killer? Now you know. He doesn't sleep. He smokes. He calls his mother twice and tells her the truth for maybe the first time in his life. He cries in front of a minister and a camera crew on the same night, and you're left to decide for yourself which one, if either, was real. He tries to trade 30 dead women for a few more weeks of his own life, and the governor of Florida tells him no. And at 7:16 in the morning, strapped into a chair older than his own parents, his very last words on earth are an expression of love, reserved entirely for the 2 men standing close enough to hear it. Maybe that's the real ending to this story. Not the volts, not the crowd outside with the signs. The fact that a man capable of that kind of tenderness chose, every single day for 5 years, not to extend it to anyone who actually needed it. If this is the kind of case breakdown you want more of, not the shorthand version, the actual paper trail, subscribing costs you nothing, and it's the only reason this channel can keep digging through primary sources instead of repeating whatever's already on the first page of search results. And if you've got a case you think deserves this same treatment, drop it in the comments. I read every one, and a few of you have already sent me the next episode.